Welcome to our February 2025 live Visa Bulletin webinar and our chatting with Charlie. Hi, Charlie.
Hello. How's everybody this afternoon?
Good. Um, so for this webinar, we welcome questions. If you just type it in the Q&A, and we will go through some questions we actually received previously. And you want to mark your calendars for our next Chatting with Charlie live Visa Bulletin webinar, which will be on March 26, 2025. Follow us on LinkedIn to get the information and to sign up and register. So let's start it off. So what we wanted to do today was actually give a refresher on the mechanics of the Visa Bulletin. The last time Charlie and I did this was back in one of our first Chatting with Charlies back in December of 2022. So we thought it'd be a good time to kind of bring back the basics. Of course, his predictions and trends, and then just the Visa Bulletin summary. So we'll start it off. Okay, Charlie, as we give a refresher, why don't we just talk briefly about what exactly is the Visa Bulletin?
Sure. The Immigration and Nationality Act, known as the INA, it establishes annual limits in both the family-sponsored categories and the employment-based visa categories. And it sets for the employment, it sets a minimum of 140,000 plus any unused numbers from the family categories in the previous years. And that there's a limit on the amount of green cards and visas which can be issued under each of the different preference categories, and that is broken down also by country of birth. There's the country of birth. The Congress has established a 7% per country limit that was established in an attempt to prevent a handful of countries from monopolizing the use of all available numbers. So they kind of wanted to, quote, spread the wealth among all countries.
Okay. And then if we go to the next slide, can you kind of give us the history of how they've actually allocated the numbers?
Sure. In the Immigration Act of 1990, revamped the visa categories and for both family applicants and employment. It went from 2 employment categories, which previously had only been a 3rd and a 6th preference. They established 5 new visa categories in the employment category. And with each of those 5 categories receiving a percentage of the overall limit, the employment first, second, and third preference categories receive 26 or 28.6% of the overall employment limit, and the fourth and fifth preference get 7.1% of the limit. The factors which control the Visa Bulletin are the amount of numbers which are available in any given year, how many numbers have been used up to that point in the fiscal year, and anticipated demand for the remainder of the year. And the Visa Bulletin, the dates listed in the Visa Bulletin are the State Department's attempt in collaboration with the USCIS in an effort to maximize number use under each of the visa categories. Typically, the Visa Bulletin is released and posted online about the middle of the month, typically between the 12th and 15th of each month, at which times this is done to provide practitioners and those interested in the various visa categories to see what is going on for the upcoming month.
Okay. And why don't we just kind of talk about the mechanics of the Visa Bulletin? Because we know about the priority date, the dates for filing, and the final action date.
The priority date is basically your date when you get in line. If you're going to the deli counter, you grab the number, that's when you're going to get served. So that's the priority dates which are listed. The dates for filing, that has been used by the USCIS since October of 2015. And those dates for filing were initiated in the Visa Bulletin listing so that applicants could begin filing their paperwork with USCIS so that when their case their priority date becomes eligible, say 4, 5, 7 months down the road, USCIS would have been able to have pre-processed it, and they can be issued their green card or an adjustment of status at that point, instead of having to wait until further down the road to do so. I was a big proponent of this because by USCIS instituting this Chart B in the Visa Bulletin application filing dates, it gave me much better visibility into demand. Prior to USCIS using this and allowing people to file early and me see what the effects were, if the date had been moving 1 week at a time and that had resulted in 500 applicants, say for India third preference, if I moved the date a week for the month of March, I was having to assume that that was going to result in 500 once again. That may not be the case. It could have been 800, 1,000, or it could have been 50. So it resulted in having to rely on estimates based on historical patterns, created much more volatility. So with these dates for filing, immigration can process the case, request a visa number from the State Department. If a number is not available, it goes into state's backlog and it's visible when state is making the determination of the upcoming month's final action dates. And the final action dates are those which will govern processing in that specific month being announced for the Visa Bulletin. For example, we know the final action dates were announced for February in mid-January, and that represents the amount of applicants who are eligible for final action in the month of February.
Okay, and it's really important that everyone understand that your date has to be before the date that's published on the Visa Bulletin, right, Charlie?
Correct. The final action dates, which are listed, and the application filing dates is the priority date of the first applicant who could not be accommodated for processing in that given month or during the time period the application filing dates represent.
Okay.
And again, and with the one thing I forgot to mention, the dates for filing, called the application filing dates, those are typically where the State Department believes the final action date will be in about 8 to 12 months in the future.
Okay. If we go to the next slide, these are the different categories, which I'll just run through very quickly, that we're talking about when we're going through the Visa Bulletin. And of course, the first preference category is extraordinary ability and our outstanding researchers, professors, and our multinational managers and executives. And this typically moves the fastest and typically is current, which we'll talk about later. EB2 are for our advanced degree professionals, our national interest waiver, and those of exceptional ability. So these are the positions that require for perm either a bachelor's and 5 years of progressive experience post-baccalaureate or at least a master's degree. And then EB3 is for everyone else. These are our professionals and our skilled and unskilled workers. This is where the requirement for the position is at least 2 years of education, training, or experience. And then EB4 is for our religious workers and special immigrants. And then EB5 is for our investor green cards. So that's just the basics of the employment-based category. And then, Charlie, why don't you talk about what are some of the limitations and what happens with the dependents and how do you move from one preference category to another?
Sure. As I mentioned before, each of the employment categories gets a percentage of the overall annual limit. And and if you view these limitations as your household budget, if your employer gave you a paycheck on October 1st, and that's the only money you were going to get through September 30th of the next year, you would look at that paycheck and you'd say, okay, I'm going to have to establish my household budget for the next 12 months. And you would make assumptions on your utility cost, your housing cost, whatever. And then you would reevaluate those estimates relating to actual spending and how much you have for the remainder of the year. And so that's what the State Department does basically. They try to provide numbers throughout the course of the year and maximize number use within the various annual limits. A dependent is considered part of the visa case. So if there is a principal applicant, they have a spouse and 2 children, that requires the use of 4 numbers. So the spouse and 2 children are using visa numbers against the annual limit along with the principal applicant. And in terms of moving from one category to the other, an applicant can file their petition in as many categories as they are eligible for. So, and then often, say an applicant may initially file their petition in the employment third preference category. And because of the length of time that petition remains pending before it can be finalized, they get additional expertise and they are eligible to move up to and file in the second preference category because they are now entitled to that. So they can move up to the second. Sometimes we see people looking at the dates and moving their cases up or down. And one question we've had in past couple of years is if an applicant had a petition, say, in employment second or third preference category, could they also apply in the employment fifth preference category? And the answer is yes. So again, you can file petitions in any category you're entitled to status in. And this basically gives you potentially multiple chances at a visa each month, and your case would be finalized in whichever category your priority date comes up in fastest.
Yeah, because you can keep your priority date. So you could keep the earliest priority date even if you move from one preference category to another. And we usually call that changing lanes. Like if you're in the EB2 lane and then you see the EB3 becomes faster, and then you want to move to the EB3 lane. That's a very common occurrence in our field. We can go to the next slide. Okay, chargeability. That's a lot of questions because we get people who say, "But Charlie, I was born in China, but I am a citizen of Canada. Why can't I use Canada number?"
Right. The chargeability, everybody needs a chargeability because, as I mentioned, there are per country limitations on the amount of visas. They don't want, country X to use all the numbers at the expense of all the other letters of the alphabet. So they assign a chargeability, and typically chargeability is determined by your place of birth. So if you were born in China and you're now a citizen of another country, that doesn't matter. It is your place of birth in China which governs the chargeability. Now, cross chargeability is, say, if a spouse, an Indian applicant, were in the employment third preference category, they were married to an applicant from another country, say Canada or whatever. Canada has a more favorable priority or final action date in employment third than India. So the Indian principal applicant would derive the employment third preference category chargeability, and the spouse would then confer their Canadian place of birth as the chargeability where the applicant would be charged. And then so they would be both charged as Canada third preference number use. This cross chargeability was originally done because you had a lot of people off earlier on because of government work, or they were missionaries or whatever. They would be in a country not of their own free will, and they would have a child that was born there, and therefore, instead of the child being charged against that country, if it was not favorable, they could use the parents' chargeability. For example, if an applicant from Canada, they were in Mexico on working for the Canadian government or a job or whatever, basically not of their free will moving there on a permanent basis, they had a baby, that baby would not necessarily need to be charged to Mexico, which the dates are not as good. They could be charged to Canada. In terms of countries becoming oversubscribed, as I mentioned, there is a limitation on how many applicants from various countries can come in. And if there is too many applicants from a country, currently that would be from China, India, Mexico, and the Philippines. Those countries have more applicants who have petitions and approved petitions and are attempting to immigrate to the US, but the amount of applicants exceeds the amount of numbers available in one or more visa categories. So they're considered to be oversubscribed.
Okay. And then if we go to the next slide, we just talk about the typically oversubscribed countries, right? Which you had mentioned.
Right. So again, China, India, Mexico, and Philippines, they have at least one of the final action dates in a preference category is earlier than that of the worldwide date, and that date is imposed in order to limit number use within their applicable annual limit.
Yeah, and we'll go through that so you all can see how it relates to number usage and movement of the Visa Bulletin if you're born in one of those countries. Um, so backlogs and retrogression. We got a question about how come the Visa Bulletin doesn't move every month? Like, why does it stay still for 6 months? And then how come sometimes it jumps backwards? So why don't you talk to us about backlogs and retrogression?
Right. If you have an annual limit and say the limit is 1,000, but there's only 800 people competing for numbers in it, then you've got plenty of numbers to satisfy the demand. But if suddenly that category, instead of 800, it goes up to, there are suddenly 1,200 applicants competing for numbers. Well, if the limit's 1,000, you've got an additional 200 people that cannot be processed in that particular year. And therefore, you've got a quote backlog of applicants. And these backlogs, they're very prevalent, primarily in the employment categories in the oversubscribed countries, China, India, and the Philippines, and to some extent, Mexico. And again, the amount of applicants competing for numbers exceeds the amount available. Therefore, there is a backlog on those that cannot be processed. There's sometimes, if the annual limit is 1,000 and it gets toward the end of the year and the State Department realizes, okay, if we leave the final action date that was announced for August in place, that's going to result in more than 1,000 people having received visa numbers by the end of September. So what they will do is they will retrogress, which is moving the date back. Say it may move back from January 1st of 2023 to July 1st of 2022. And that movement back to July is intended to limit future number use so the annual limit is not exceeded. Typically, these retrogressions occur at the end of a fiscal year, most likely in either August and or September. The reason when I was chief of the visa office, and I know that they're following this policy now, you know that the retrogressions have a deep impact on the applicants. And to be perfectly honest, it impacts the government as well, because if something backs up, people are going to be complaining, writing letters which need to be answered. That results in staff time having to address the letters, which could be doing other duties. So again, any retrogressions typically would try to hold them till the end of the year, so that with the start of the new fiscal year in October, when there's an entirely new supply of numbers, that a recovery from their retrogression can occur, and you can move the date back to the best available in the preceding year and take care of those people that may have been inconvenienced for 1 to 2 months. The impact of the retrogression on the waiting period, If it is a prolonged retrogression, for example, I mentioned typically you would try to do it at the end of the year, but if that retrogression has occurred because the volume of applicants has exceeded the previous estimates, it's possible that they may not be able to recover from the retrogression for October. And that recovery period may take many more months. So again, it's hard to say how long the retrogressions would be in place. One of the benefits of the Visa Bulletin is the State Department will always try to use the Visa Bulletin to announce potential issues that they see which will affect applicants in the processing of their cases. I would always try to give at least 1 to 2 months notice if I thought it was likely that there would be something uh, such as a retrogression, which could negatively impact the processing of cases so that people could keep up to speed and not be caught completely blindsided. Uh, in terms of what can be done in advance of a retrogression, I would always advise applicants to act in a very timely manner. If you're eligible to file based on the application filing dates, do so as quickly as possible. You don't know how long that benefit may be applied. As we saw, it is no effective in February. It will no bit longer be possible. And because of potential retrogressions, which typically would occur later in the year, you want to submit all requested information as quickly as possible and as early in the year so that your case can be finalized earlier. And I always advise people to try not to reschedule a scheduled appointment. This would primarily be for overseas applicants. If your case is scheduled in January, that's not the greatest time to be pulling the kids out of school. So you might think about, okay, the kids are out of school in July. I'll reschedule, ask that my case be rescheduled for July. Well, that may be fine, but by July, the category you're in, the final action date may have retrogressed. So although you could have received your visa in January or February or March, and by July, when you rescheduled your appointment, the number is not available again, and it may be the next fiscal year before you can be processed. So again, unless it's an extreme emergency, I always advise people to uh, use their originally scheduled interview. And anybody that is refused their visa at the time of their interview, they should always attempt to overcome that refusal in the month which it occurred, if that is at all possible. And if not, as quickly as possible in the upcoming months. Again, you don't want to rely on the fact that, okay, a visa number is available now, but it may not be available to you 5, 6 months down the road.
Okay. And let's go to the next slide and let's look at some of the factors that you considered when you were determining whether to freeze the number or hold the number or actually move the number back, move the date back.
Based on I would be able to see the data and I would know that how many numbers we called it allocated. So the State Department is allocated, say, X amount of numbers for the month of February for applicants who will be processed at USCIS or embassies and consulates abroad. But in making that allocation, I had to take in consideration, okay, I want to use X amount of numbers, but I know that a certain amount of the numbers I allocated will be refused or returned unused at the end of the month because either the applicant at the time of their February interview will be found ineligible and not use the number. They won't appear for their scheduled interview because they may have requested to be rescheduled or they just don't show up. So I would take care. There's a number of variables involved that need to be taken into consideration. But if I wanted to use, say, 900 numbers, I may give out 1,000 numbers, assuming that 10% are going to be returned. So, and you also the State Department will be consulting with USCIS on employment demand that they see coming in future months. That may impact the amount of numbers you want to give out and whether you move the dates or not. So, and in terms of the having multiple pending adjustment of status applications, that is not something that we could really consider because if you had an approved petition in, say, the third preference category, and you had filed that petition in your paperwork based on the application filing dates, then when your case is finalized, a number may not be available at the time, but the USCIS would report that case to the State Department. And USCIS cases are identified by A numbers. So they would say that we have 5 Indian third preference applicants, and they would give A number whatever. So that A number is sitting in the State Department's database. The Immigration Service could not, if that applicant has been waiting for a period of time and upgrades their case to employment second, they cannot also submit a request for a visa number using A number 123 in the second preference unless they remove the third preference request. So it's a kind of convoluted, but you really can't take that into consideration. But applicants having multiple applications, that may come into play in terms of people you thought were going to be showing up for their interview would not.
Yeah, so basically, you thought they were in the EB3 category, so you had an allocated number of what you knew was gonna be, able to be distributed, but then someone jumps up to EB1, and then they actually get a number from EB1, reducing the number in the EB3. So a lot of changing lanes happens, and that's, I think, why it's difficult, but you can only get your green card based on one employment-based category. Right?
Right.
Are there one
Eh,
you honor?
Yeah, you're only going to be charged in one category. And again, the accounting for the applicants with multiple, potentially multiple petitions and various things, that's kind of taken into consideration on the assumed return rate of unused numbers, so that kind of accounts for that.
Okay. And then let's go to the next slide. And this is just the example we wanted to share, right? And this is basically, I think, Charlie's budgeting type of example. So it'll give you an idea of why the number usage changes.
Right. So again, here for the month of January, State Department has said we want to use 2,000 numbers. They saw that they only had demand for 1,000 applicants. So there is no need to list a final action date. The category would be listed as current. But by the time they got around to deciding the February dates, their target was still to use 800 or 2,000 numbers. There had been a big effort to process a backlog of petitions. So suddenly they are faced with the fact that they have 8,000 applicants with petitions eligible. So they can't give out all 8,000. So they establish a final action date. And that date would be the priority date of the 2001st applicant. So the remaining applicants would be in line competing for numbers when the March dates are determined.
Okay, so someone asked, how come the Department of State just doesn't publish that we have this many numbers left?
The numbers are changing on a regular basis. So they could publish today that they have, X amount of numbers remaining. That number will be different this time next week because numbers are being requested by the Immigration Service on a daily basis. Once they are ready to finalize action on a case, they will set it. The officer will be reviewing your case and they will say, Charina is eligible for a visa in preference category X from country Y. They would type that information into their computer, entering her place of birth, her priority date, her A number, etc. And then they would press the enter button. That information goes to the State Department. And if a visa number is available for her priority date, the USCIS would get an immediate authorization response. They could print that response out, stick it in Charina's case file, and ship it off to get a green card produced. So that is happening on hundreds and hundreds of requests are coming into the State Department a day. Also, the overseas post. Again, I mentioned that somebody may have been refused in an earlier month when they went into their interview in Mumbai. So they came back today. They say, okay, you're overcoming your refusal. We didn't have a number. So Mumbai would request a visa number from the State Department, and the State Department would give one out. So again, the amount of numbers is in a constant state of flux. In terms of publishing the data, it would be pretty much misleading if they were to do so.
Yeah, so I think the message basically is Department of State will determine every month how many they can allocate, what their target is. So for in this example, it's 2,000. And what they can't predict is how many applicants they'll actually receive in that particular month. So in the first example, they receive less than their allocation target. So the dates are current, they have enough numbers. But then in the second month in February, they had budgeted 2,000, but then they got 8,000 applicants. And so in that situation, they have too many applicants. And so they have to kind of freeze the date or roll it back. So that's how the backlog occurs, or retrogression. But you'll see examples of that in the real Visa Bulletin when we go through it. So, okay, immigrant visa numerical allocation. We have a picture here, um, of, water flowing down, and we're gonna kind of explain that and how the immigrant visa numbers are allocated. And then our next slide is about taking a number. So it's just like what Charlie said, when you're sitting in the deli line and you're waiting, and this one, I think you're after me, and he's at 86,537, which could be a realistic number that people are holding, right? And so it's really just basically waiting for your place in line and your number to be called. And so Charlie, why don't you explain the next chart, which kind of explains where extra numbers go?
Yeah, this is, if you look at it, it's kind of confusing. I mentioned several times there is a certain amount of numbers available for each of the preference categories. We'll start from the far left. The employment first preference category, if there is not enough applicants to use all of the numbers available for employment first preference use, any of those unused numbers will then fall down to the employment second and be added to the original employment second preference limit. And that in past years, for several years, that allowed the India second preference date to move at a very rapid pace. If there's not enough demand in the second preference category to use all the available numbers, any remaining unused would fall to the employment third and be added to that original limit. There is no fall down from the third. If there were unused third preference numbers, they would fall back up for potential use in the first preference. In the employment fourth preference and fifth preference, if there is not sufficient demand to use all the available numbers under those annual limits, those unused numbers fall up to the employment limit first preference, EB1. And that process for many, many years allowed the employment first preference to be current for all countries. Right now, the only countries that are not current are India and China. But again, this is it's kind of like a never-ending cycle. And the intent of this is Congress did not want any numbers to be wasted. So if there wasn't sufficient demand to use all available numbers, they would fall to a category where there was demand. Again, trying to maximize number use each year under the annual limits.
When do they make these determinations of whether they can move the numbers up to EB1?
This can be done, I would do it beginning in the year, often in October when I was establishing the October dates, because I knew the historical pattern was that all the say at one time at least, that all the EB4 or the EB5 numbers were not going to be used. So I would know, okay, historically, there's at least 1,000 EB4 or EB5 numbers that are going to be unused. And so I would, at the beginning of the year, I would let those 1,000 be added to my calculation of the employment first preference category, because I wanted there to be sufficient time for those numbers to be used by EB1 applicants. And if not needed there, then they could be falling down to employment second. So the calculation on whether the numbers can fall up or down is done on a regular basis uh, throughout the years. And again, in an effort to maximize number use by the end of the year.
How about if you're incorrect? How about if there's
If-
more
if you're-
people using the numbers in EB4 than you thought?
Yeah, if that's incorrect, you can, and when I would make the estimates, I would continually monitor it. And if suddenly I saw that, okay, I thought there was going to be 1,000 unused numbers before, demand has started to increase dramatically. Well, then I would have to take corrective action. And I wouldn't let all 1,000 numbers be used, say in October or November or December. Those 1,000 would be spread out over over the course of the year, but in a steady flow. So if there were some kind of corrective action needed on the estimates, it would not be a problem. But if in the end, the EB4 would not be penalized because I had made an incorrect estimate. If I thought there were going to be 1,000 unused and it turned out that there were only, 200, well, I wouldn't shortchange the fourth preference applicants by the difference. They would
Okay.
still get their entire allotment.
Okay, gotcha. So if we go to the next slide, let's now talk about the Trump administration and what can we expect the impact will be with all the changes and the executive orders on the Visa Bulletin.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of important to remember that much of the Trump empire is built on business endeavors and employment. So I would think that the Trump administration, in many regards, is is going to look very favorable on employment categories. The employment categories uh, provide a tremendous economic benefit to the United States. So again, I would not expect any major changes. Also, the quotas are established in the Immigration and Nationality Act, and I believe that would require congressional action to make any changes in terms of how many numbers are available, because there's strict guidelines indicating how that information is determined. Uh, if there was reduced funding for whatever reason, funding is required to staff the various government offices. So if there is less funding available, that could result in slower processing times. Uh, for the basic reason, there's not enough employees to do the required work. Or we've seen in the past where there was not a reduction in funding, it was just that there was more demand for numbers. More people were filing petitions, more people were doing various processes, and there were not enough staff under the normal staffing to handle that. Again, it could result in increased processing times. And the effect of increased processing times, depending on the visa category, it may impact the movement of the dates. Because if you do not have enough applicants with approved petitions in the pipeline to use all the available numbers, then it could accelerate the movement of the priority dates, or excuse me, accelerate the movement of the final action dates. I do not anticipate that happening. There are sufficient numbers of applicants in the oversubscribed countries such as China and India to use all of the available numbers for the foreseeable future, even if they stop processing new petitions, et cetera, at this time.
Yeah, so I think what Charlie's trying to say is that President Trump can't change the allocated numbers and the quotas by an executive order, right? It has to have congressional action. But what he can do, and which he has done and announced, is impacting the funding and the staffing of certain government roles. And I know recently he just announced an incentive for people to retire. Is that right, Charlie? 8 months?
That's what I've heard.
Yeah. And so you'll have, so the question is whether he will replace those individuals who decide to leave. And then the increased processing time, this is what we saw in Trump 1.0, where lots of things were held at a standstill or processed very slowly. But of course it was COVID during that time. And so that's when we saw a lot of cases being processed, I think, on the USCIS side, right, Charlie? Because the posts were all closed. But it's probably not going to be the same result where there's like hundreds and thousands of extra numbers, right? So we could go to the next slide and Charlie can kind of walk through what we actually saw in terms of number use during Trump 1.0.
Yeah, the top line in fiscal 2016, that was the first year prior to Trump 1.0. So you see the annual limit, the amount of numbers used. Then during the course of the Trump administration, 2017 through 2020, you will see the annual limits, and you will see that number use was very, very close to the annual limits. It is almost impossible to hit the limit exactly. You're always going to be a certain amount over or under because you're having to make estimates on number use. But as I said, you can see that there was really no impact at all on the number use, with the exception of 2020, when there was a slight reduction, but that was entirely due to the fact that number use from March through the September of 2020 was reduced because of the COVID impact, which basically shut down everything. And I think the USCIS did an outstanding job in allowing the 1,000 or 147,153 numbers to be used. USCIS kind of went above and beyond what probably could have been expected of them at that time period when most things were shut down because of COVID processing issues.
What happened to the extra 9,000 numbers that weren't used, Charlie?
Those numbers were then, quote, fall across for potential use in the determination of the fiscal 2021 family-sponsored annual limit. But for all intents and purposes, those 9,000 numbers were lost forever.
Oh, okay. So basically just from what Charlie's saying, the number usage was actually still the same. So nothing really changed during Trump 1.0, right?
Right.
Okay, so we go to the next slide and let's talk about your predictions and the trends. So this is February 2025 and the final action trend for rest of world or all chargeabilities. And we see for EB1, it's current across the board, as you said. And then EB2 was inching a little slowly from February 2024, moved up March, April, and then held from May and June, and then moved up a little bit again in July, and then has been holding steady until January 2025 and moved up by a couple weeks, and now is just staying there. And then EB3, we see it moving a bit in February through April. And then when you see the red arrow, that means retrogression. That means when it goes back. And so we see some retrogression in July and September. Actually, I think September's the same. And then in October, some movement, and then December movement, and then February, no movement. So any comments on this, Charlie?
Yeah, basically the red indicated they ran out of numbers. Their estimates on number use earlier in the year were too low. They were using far too many numbers, and they basically ran out. They had to impose those December 1st, 2020 dates in order to stop number use at the end of the year.
Yes. Yeah, so EB3 in September 2024 actually rolled back a whole year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, The dates I started announcing probably about 18 months or so ago. I think back at the end of fiscal 2023. It appears that the State Department is going to a policy where they're making their major changes on the movement of the dates on a quarterly basis. The quarters being October, then the second quarter is January, the third quarter would be April. So that's what has been happening for the most part. That the dates change at the beginning of each quarter. Then there might be some slight change in the next 2 months if they see that their estimates were lower than expected, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing to see the date hold for a period of time because there is normally sufficient demand with applicant demand with priority dates beyond that date, so that they know that, okay, if they hold the date until they get a good idea of how many numbers are actually being used, are their estimates high, low, or right on par, then they can make adjustments down the road, and they don't risk the volatility of dates moving retrogressing, moving backwards. We saw that a couple of years ago where they would have often multiple retrogressions within the course of a year. That is very detrimental to everybody. So that is to be avoided at all possible.
Okay, and if we go to the next slide, this one talks about employment-based China. So any comments you have on this?
Now, here again, you see the October big changes, October, January. The February for China third preference did advance. My guess is that is because that they saw that the amount of number use through December was not quite as high as they had expected. They would have not known that at the time they initially set the January dates. So they made a slight adjustment to the February date to allow more applicants to be processed. Again, it's a very good thing.
Yeah, but then if you look up February 2024 to February 2025, all across the board, you're only seeing movement of about, at the most, maybe 4 months, right? So I don't think you can assume, and what we always tell our clients, that it's going to move every month, right? You could just see in the whole span of 1 year, the movement for China was only about 3 months total, right?
Yeah, and it's important to remember that some people that are kind of new to the immigration issues, they saw the very rapid movement of the final action dates during the period of fiscal 21, fiscal 22, fiscal 23, and to some extent fiscal 24. But the 21, 22, and 23 annual limits were at all-time record highs, and that was an extremely artificially result. And it's because I mentioned earlier, any unused family numbers from the previous years are added to the next year's employment limit. The State Department processes approximately 95% of all the family-sponsored numbers. Those offices were closed. So in fiscal 2022, the annual limit, I believe, was 281,000, which is double the annual limit. So again, there was an artificial movement. Things are kind of getting back to normal now. And there were backlogs which developed, processing backlogs with labor and or USCIS. And those backlogs have been addressed during fiscal 24 and continuing to 25. Those backlogs, when they were cleared out, resulted in many, many more applicants being eligible to compete for numbers, resulting in the limited movement of the dates in fiscal 24 and so far in 25.
Yeah, and you can see for EB3, China actually, in February 2024, it was September 1, 2020. But now in February, it's actually moved backwards. It's July 1, 2020 in a span of.
One other thing that is worth mentioning while we're on this is for a number of years, the rest of world employment second and third preference categories were listed as current, meaning there were more than enough numbers to satisfy applicants from most countries. That allowed any of those unused numbers under the annual limit to be added to the India limits for employment second and third, and potentially in the same situation with China. So there were many more numbers available. In recent years, there has been a rest of world employment second and third preference category final action date, meaning that China and India are only eligible to receive the numbers available under the respective per country annual limits, which will greatly reduce forward movement of those final action dates.
Okay, and if we go to India in the next slide, any comments on this?
Nope. Here it's a good thing. Their estimates of number use have been a little lower than originally expected, which has allowed them to make the movement in December, and then the quarterly movement in January, and again they've gone ahead and moved it somewhat in February.
Yeah, and you see from February 2024 to February 2025, it's a pretty big jump, right? From September 2020 to February 2022. And then just some movement, EB2, March 1, 2012 to October 15, 2012. And then EB3, you see it also moving from July 1, 2012 to December 15, 2012. Next slide. Okay, your predictions, Charlie. What do you want to predict for us?
Yeah, these are my when you see for example, in the China employment first preference, 1 week. That's 1 week on average. So if you over a 4 week period, you would expect, or excuse me, a 4 month period, you would expect the dates to be moving. But I'm doing monthly average, so the date may hold, but then it would recover when it did advance to cover the predicted movement. And these predictions have proven very accurate the past 2 years. And one of the things I always did when I was in the government and speaking with organizations and various groups, I always tried to be a little bit pessimistic on my predictions of movement, because if I tell you, okay, you're a Chinese applicant, and I say, okay, you're employment first preference category, the date's going to move 1 week. Well, if it moves 3 weeks or 4 weeks, you're going to be very happy because it was exceeded. But if I've told you 1 week and you make changes to your lifestyle, you make decisions based on the fact, well, okay, Charlie said it's going to move 1 week. In 3 months, my date's going to be available. Great. So I don't want people to be, the dates have been too optimistic, and then they be very disappointed. Again, always rather people be pleasantly surprised than their dashes of hope, you know.
Okay. So we have time for, I think the next slide is, just talking about our rapid and our capabilities of doing some predictions with Charlie. And so if you're interested in that, please reach out to us. And then the next slide just shows some of our other, next slide. Yeah, some of our sample reports where we do some budgeting that will help you with based on Charlie's predictions. And then we have time for some questions, so let's answer a few. We can go to the next slide. Does the addition of unused fiscal year 2024 family preference visas tend to have the most impact on EB1 backlog countries?
No, the addition of any fiscal 2024 family numbers are distributed among each of the 5 employment categories based on the percentages I mentioned earlier: 28.6% for the first, second, and third, and 7.1% for the fourth and fifth. So they're not all concentrated in one category.
Okay, and do you think the Philippines EB3 is likely to fall behind the rest of world date?
I think because of the slow forward movement of the rest of world, both employment second and third preference dates. I think that there is an excellent chance that the Philippines third will remain at the rest of world date for the coming months. Things could change if there are a large amount of Philippines applicants who suddenly, if there was a backlog in processing and suddenly a large amount are reported with priority dates earlier than the current date, that could impact it. But again, I think things for the moment look positive for Philippine third preference staying at rest of world date.
Okay, what's your guess regarding possible reasons behind USCIS not publishing recent statistical data?
One of the things is when I was working for the government, the USCIS would often have their offices do a inventory process during the month of September, and that would often slow some forms of processing. Uh, they also may be having staffing issues, which reduce the amount of people that can be working on specific areas. They may have more pressing issues that the people need to address other than getting out the statistical data. One thing that often impacts workload during the month of December is the federal government employees have annual leave, and many of the government employees will take several weeks, potentially a week or 2 weeks of annual leave that they've saved up through the course of the year and use it during the month of December. So things kind of slow down greatly during the month of December. So there's a number of reasons. Hopefully, they will start publishing more data and increase the transparency. Having the transparency is good, seems for everybody, but it is not necessary for people to be filing FOIAs, et cetera, or making potentially erroneous assumptions. So if you can take a look at the actual data, it's just more reassuring.
Okay, we go to the next slide. We probably can answer a couple more. What can merit-based immigration look like?
In calendar year 2013, there was a comprehensive immigration reform effort. Both the Senate and the House were looking at areas how they could reform the immigration policy. Immigration has not really changed since the Immigration Act of 1990. So one of the proposals was that there would be merit-based processing. For example, if I had a master's degree, I would get X points. If I had a PhD, I would get more points, etc. It really never gained a lot of traction because it was kind of convoluted. How do I keep, is my expertise increases, how do I constantly getting my merit ability changed? Many countries have it. Countries such as Canada and Australia use a merit-based process, but the US has not done that so far.
Okay, well, we're at time and we'll save the rest of the questions for our March webinar. And then we had some that we weren't able to answer. But thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again hopefully in March.